All right, this is 3.1 in your textbook, page 142. We're talking about relations. So relations are really important moving forward. In grade 10, it's almost, I would say, 75% to 80% of the entire course is based on what's called quadratic relations, or at least 50% anyway. So it's a type of relation. So relations are really important. Another way you can think of relations is just think of graphs, because typically a relation is describing how two variables are connected. So when we look at a graph, obviously, however the graph is, it's describing one variable on one axis and another variable on another axis. Okay, so any graph that you see with values populated is a relation. Okay, so that's one way you can think of it, a relation. There's two main things we need to know about all relations is that there's an independent variable and there's a dependent variable. Okay, the independent variable, in common language, really all you got to remember is choose. Okay? It's the variable that you choose. That's going to be your biggest hint. Okay, so your independent variable. So if I talk about any two things, you got to think in your mind, okay, which one of these two things can I pick? Okay, so for a lot of science graphs, always on the x-axis, what do you see? Almost always on a science graph. It's always down here. Most of the time we're doing observations, and the independent variable is what?
Independent variable.
Yeah, good. The independent variable is down here for all graphs, but what is it in science typically? You're doing an experiment, you're typically looking at something's happening, and yeah?
The time frame.
Yeah, the time. Almost always, time is on the horizontal axis. Okay? And that's typically because we can choose how often we observe these things, how often or how long. Okay? So a common one would be plant growth, height. Okay, so you do this in grade 11, you'll plant beans, and what you'll see over the course of several days, you'll get this kind of graph of your plant growth height. Okay? Remember, plant growth height is the dependent variable. So the important word that we want to remember in a dependent variable is the variable that you calculate, or another good word for that is measure. Okay, you measure it. You're calculating it, you're measuring it. Okay? So these are the biggest two clues that will help you from confusing independent and dependent variable. Okay? Independent you choose, it goes on the axis. Time, I'm going to choose the number of hours that I observe it. I'm going to choose the days. Okay? Maybe I'm only going to have this experiment run for a month. Maybe I'm going to check on my beanstalk a year later. I'm choosing how often and how long. Okay, so those two words, choose and measure, this is the one that I'm calculating. You can pretty much answer now any question that we may have of what's dependent or independent. All right, let's go through some examples. So, if I can put them up here. So let's see, example 1, example 2, example 3, example 4. So let's say speed and time. All right? What do you think is going to be dependent and what's going to be independent? So we're looking at a car and we're measuring its speed, right? Well, we want to see how fast it goes. We can't measure time. Time is consistent, right? Time's the same. Chris?
Speed would be independent.
No. Speed, the independent is the one that you choose. You're not choosing the speed. You're observing a car. You're not the driver. You're actually observing the car. Even if you are the driver, you can't necessarily choose your speed. You can come close, but you still have something it's measuring it. Yeah.
The time is.
Right. So time is down here. Time is always consistent. It's always the same. And speed is the thing that's calculated, right? It's the thing that's measured. So speed is your dependent variable. So I'm checking my speed here at time 1. I'm speeding up and going faster and faster. Okay? Same thing for distance in time. Distance is your dependent, time is your independent. Okay? What about, let's say you're in a NHL 14 hockey tournament and you're playing with your buddies at your buddy's house and you make a graph and you want to actually chart your graph. And it's games played versus number of goals scored. Okay, so it's a little bit more difficult. It's not strict time, but you're tracking the number of games you play and the number of goals you score. Okay, so this is for, let's say, Joseph. Joseph, what would you say?
Games played with the independent
Good. And where would I put it?
on F.
Good. On this one, right. So games played. And on the dependent?
Goal scored.
Goals. Good. Okay, you guys starting to see how this works?
Yeah.
You're choosing how many games you play, right? Maybe your graph's only going to be this big. Maybe you only have time to play 2 games and then your mom calls you for dinner. Okay? And that's you only got. You got 1 goal and 3 goals. Okay? Let's try another one. How about number of hours slept and level of grumpiness? Which one's dependent and which one's independent? Think about it. Which one are you choosing and which one are you measuring? All right.
So can you really choose like how grumpy you are, like how?
Not really. So,
You can't really choose how much time you sleep.
sure you can. You decide what time you go to bed.
No, but then like
Set the
sometimes
alarm.
I wake up. No, like my alarm, I don't really do that.
You sleep by the wind, right? It's like whatever the wind blows, that's when you wake up.
Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, but you also choose what time you go to bed, no?
No, I just wait till I like pass out. I mean, it's actually.
All right.
I have trouble sleeping, so that's what I do.
Okay. Okay, but for most people, if you're running an experiment, right? One of the things you could control, if you're running an experiment, let's say,
Then sleep would be independent.
yes, the number of hours. Yeah, you can't control your grumpiness, right? I would say you can control how many hours you sleep easier than how grumpy you are, right?
Okay,
You know, accurately, right? So I would say the control variable then, I hope most of you guys agreed on this, number of hours slept, and then the dependent, or the one that you measure, is grumpiness level. Okay, so maybe you have certain characteristics for grumpiness. You know, how many people did I say to go take a hike today? You know, you told 3 people. That's a very high level of grumpiness. You know, certain measuring, variables that you can create. But at the end of the day, that's your measure. And that's your chosen. You're choosing the number of hours. Okay. Let's try one more. Who's got an example? Who's got a tricky one? Anyone think of a tricky one? Yeah.
Number of times you went to the mall and the number of times you actually bought something.
Okay.
That's not
Well, that is tricky.
That is tricky.
But in
I think you could maybe answer this both ways, but let's see. Yeah, Michael?
number of times you go to the mall is independent because you can choose when you go to a mall.
Yes. Very good. Number of times going to mall and number of times buying. Okay? It could. The reason why I'm going to argue it this way is because I think number of times you go to the mall, if you're running an experiment, that would be something that you could easily control. Whereas it would make sense that number of times you buy something, if you're doing like a marketing experiment, let's say, so you're seeing like the successfulness of advertisements. So you're controlling how often the person goes to the mall, but then you're measuring how that marketing advertisement, encourages that person to buy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that would be your measurable. So very good. That was a tricky one. Dan.
Sir, you also can't buy anything unless you're at the
Yeah.
Right, yeah, good. You can't buy anything unless you're at the mall.
That's what
But
I
you
thought.
could argue it the other way too, right? You could say, well, maybe my mom drops me off at the mall 3 times a week, so I have no choice on that. I'm sorry, that would still be the,
Yes,
Independent
there could be a certain formula on how many times you buy it, how many times you go to.
okay, I'll see you guys after lunch.
Will there be a price?